Hi, class. We are finally at the ethics part of our class. And this lecture and some of our discussions are the main reasons that I was able to get this class an e-focus. So that'll help you. That'll be helpful in getting you guys to graduate. But beyond that, ethics is a central part of research, and so it's a really good place for you to learn some ethical principles and put them to place. And I kind of started to lay the ground for that in our lecture yesterday when I talked about making your survey short and to the point because participants in your research are mostly, in most cases, unless you're very, very well funded, are volunteering their own time. So you really owe them, you owe them good treatment. You owe not only to make the research no longer or no more complicated than it has to be, but you should treat them right. And so ethics is a part of that general thing. And I think that you'll really be surprised and maybe shocked and horrified when you see some of the ethical violations that researchers have done in the past. And there are reasons that they justify this. I don't agree with them, but we'll talk about that as we go through the examples. So, what will we do today? Well, we've got four main sections. I'd say 3.5. That last one's super short. And at first, we're going to talk about a framework for ethical decision making. We're going to start with, and I'm going to, spoiler alert, it's not easy. It's not like rules or a checklist or anything. We're going to give you some ideas about how many people make ethical decisions. Then we're going to talk about some examples of some clearly unethical research and some of the ramifications that that research has had on society and the influence that it has had on many populations not trusting scientists, which is a bad thing because we want to help mankind. And if we want to help mankind, we have to be able to find certain characteristics that'll help us out. Then we're going to go to some definitions and about the IRB. And the IRB stands for the Institutional Review Board. The Institutional Review Board. And sometimes it's called the CHS, the Committee on Human Subjects. And I'm going to tell you what that is in that third part of the lecture, and then finally finish up with letting you know how to submit an application to the IRB at UH Manoa. So, a framework for ethical decision making. Or, this is another one of my attempt at research methods humor, which nobody ever laughs at, but I get a giggle every time I see it. It's a classroom, and they're obviously taking a test on ethics. How important are ethics in today's society? And everybody's cheating on the ethics test. Terrible, 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 funny, haha. Okay. So, like I said, it's complicated. So, we're going to start with the definition of telling you what ethics is not. It's not the same as feelings. Your feelings do not tell you what is wrong and right, although sometimes they help put us in the right direction, but they can also lead us definitely astray. Not the same as religion. The purpose of religion, despite what some doctrines may say, is to serve a higher being, not to make sure that things are fair for people of other religions and sometimes even other races. It's not the same as following the law, as we found out yesterday in our example about the duty to warn and how sometimes courts can request records from psychologists or family professionals or other types of professionals when it violates those professionals' ethical duty to the confidentiality of their clients. So it's not following the law, believe it or not. Should be, but that's not how it works. And it's not following culturally accepted norms. Some cultures have some pretty unethical, well, it depends. It's all, a lot of it's relevant, but what we would judge today as unethical, unethical practices, such as ritual sacrifice and things like that. That's cultural norm, but we would definitely say that is not ethical. And then ethics is not science. And this is what leads us into some of the trouble that we get in, because scientists want to find out about the natural world. They're very objectively finding the truth, and that doesn't always involve treating their data in the best way. So, for example, I just read a really great book called Fossil Men, and it was about these archaeologists and anthropologists and a whole team of multidisciplinary people who went into Ethiopia in the desert to look for prehistoric mankind. Actually, yeah, even before we were mankind. You guys might have heard of the fossil skeleton Lucy, who was a species before Homo sapiens, what we are. Well, they actually found something about 1.5 million years older than Lucy. And they talk about some of the problems they had getting the bones out of sacred land, which belong to some of the Ethiopian tribes. And I know some of you have some very strong feelings that even if they are 3.5 million years old, maybe it's not a good idea to disturb bones for burial. So that's another case in which ethics and science collide, as they say. So ethics is not all those things. Then what is ethics? Well, ethics is not short and sweet. It's not easy. Basically, ethics is more of a process. It's a process of applying standards to decision making. And so I'm going to go through 5 different types of decision making, or ways or standards that we can use to make ethical decisions. And we don't use them all, but the point is that we justify them and we do the best that we can with our limited little human minds to make sure that everyone involved, and sometimes more than people involved, there's a lot of work on ethical standards with animals, is treated fair and equitably. Okay, the first standard or decision-making approach is the utilitarian approach. And some ethicists emphasize that the ethical action is one that provides the most good or does the least harm, or, to put it another way, produces the greatest balance of good over harm. The ethical corporate action, then, is the one that produces the greatest good and does the least harm for all who are affected: customers, employees, shareholders, the community, and the environment. Ethical warfare balances the good achieved in ending terrorism with the harm done to all parties through death, injuries, and destruction. Ethical research balances the needs of the scientists, the general population for what good it can do, the participants in the research, and science in general. So the utilitarian approach, which is what we were talking about, deals with consequences. It tries both to increase the good done and reduce the harm done. And I like to think of the utilitarian approach as like a big equation. You can even picture it in the sky with skywriting if you want. It's just trying to balance everything out. So people are all affected as equally as they can be, and all get the good as equally as they can be. Now, another approach is the rights approach. And that's one that suggests that ethical action is the one that best protects and respects the moral rights of those affected. This approach starts from the belief that humans have dignity based on their human nature per se, or on their ability to choose freely what they do with their lives. On the basis of such dignity, they have a right to be treated as ends and not merely as means to other ends. The list of moral rights, including the rights to make one's own choices about what kind of life to lead, to be told the truth, to not be injured, and to a degree of privacy, and so on, is widely debated. Some now argue that non-humans have rights too. Also, it's often said that rights imply duties in particular, the duty to respect others' right. And so, ironically, this approach is often used by both sides of the abortion debate. Those who are pro-choice says that it is the woman's life to freely choose what she wants to be done with her body, to be told the truth, and to a degree of privacy. She doesn't have to tell everybody. And she says that, or that approach says that it's the duty of others to respect that woman's rights. Where some people will use that same argument to argue on the anti-abortion side, because they say they consider the fetus to have rights as well, and the fetus has rights not to be terminated. So, like I said, it's tricky, and there are no easy decisions, but the rights approach provides, the ethical standards provides frameworks for these decisions, and the rights approach is making decisions based on people's rights. The next one is the fairness or justice approach. Aristotle and other Greek philosophers have contributed the idea that all equals should be treated equally. Today we use this idea to say that the ethical actions treat all human beings equally, or if unequally, then fairly, based on some standard that is defensible. So one place that this argument comes in is the idea of corporate salaries. So this approach, the fairness or justice approach, would say people should be paid according to the work they do. So the easiest work that you don't have to take home with you and you don't need a lot of education or preparation for doesn't earn as much money as other types of work that take years and years of education and are the sort that you are available all different times. You know, your life is very much devoted to your career. That would be a fairness or justice approach. But the fairness or justice approach wears down when we start talking about CEOs that are making 1 million times a year what their workers are making. Is that fair? Is that just? Are things distributed equally? So that's an example of using the fairness or justice approach to make decisions. Another approach, which I think is really relevant now, is the common good approach. And the Greek philosophers have also contributed the notion that life in community is good in itself, and our actions should contribute to that life. This approach suggests that the interlocking relationships of society are the basis of ethical reasoning, and that respect and compassion for all others, especially the vulnerable, are requirements of such reasoning. And this intersects with some of the Christian beliefs that we take care of the poor and the meek. Let's see. This approach also calls attention to the common conditions that are important to the welfare of everyone. This may be a system of laws, effective police and fire departments, healthcare, a public educational system, or even public recreational areas. So this is what a lot of climate activists are arguing, that taking care of the climate benefits all of us as a whole and benefits society and even our species, so it should be a top priority. Another topical argument that this approach considers is the minimum wage environment. Many people argue that a livable minimum wage makes the whole society better. It's less crime, it's more money circulating the economy if people can't eat. There's all different things associated with that. So that's the common good approach. The best thing is what's good for everyone as a whole, as a collective. And then the last one is the virtue approach. This is a very, very ancient approach. And it proposes that ethical actions ought to be consistent with certain ideal virtues that provide for the full development of our humanity. These virtues are dispositions and habits that enable us to act according to the highest potential of our character and on behalf of values like truth and beauty, honesty, courage, compassion, generosity, tolerance, love, fidelity, integrity, fairness, self control, and prudence are all examples of such virtues. Virtue ethics asked of any action, what will I become if I do this? Or is this consistent with me acting at my best? So it takes the approach that ethics is what makes us better people according to certain universal standards. I should always love others. I should always be unselfish. I should always be honest. I should always have courage. Those are the hallmarks upon which decisions are based. So, really, really interesting. So, now you've got all these ways to make decisions, and almost just as importantly, ways to justify your decisions. So, how do we make ethical decisions? Well, the very first thing you need to do is recognize that you've got an ethical issue. Let's take the example that I just gave about minimum wage. You think that there may be some people who are working full time who are still homeless because they're not making enough money to have decent housing on the island of Oahu. So first you want to get the facts, and that's really important, especially, again, in this climate when there's a lot of alternative facts floating around. So you would get the facts about the number of people that are actually homeless. Part of the argument is, I think, a horrible argument, but many people will say that people are homeless because they can't keep down a job, because they'd rather do drugs, et cetera, et cetera. You would want to get the facts about that. And you might even consider addiction programs, all kinds of things that are part of the problem as you see it. Then you evaluate alternative actions. So what could we do? We could, as I mentioned before, make a minimum wage, raise the minimum wage. We could enact compassionate drug treatment facilities. We could do a universal standard income, which has been talked about in the news lately. We think about and possibly list all the things we might do, and then we make a decision and test it. So let's say we've thought about all these things, and this is often why the process is making decisions is difficult when it's a complex decision. Let's say we think about all these things and we think, for now I'm gonna change the minimum wage. I'm gonna see if that minimum wage really affects homeless. So you make a decision, then you test it. You look at homeless rates 6 months, a year and a half after the minimum wage has been raised, and you see if what difference it makes. Then you act and reflect on the outcome. And in this example, what would probably happen is the minimum wage would help a lot, but there would still be some issues of addiction and mental health that would need to be taken care of. So this is just the same thing, another way, because I could put it in an arrow. Recognize an ethical issue, first step, get the facts, evaluate alternative actions, make a decision and test it, and act and reflect on the outcome. So here we are now. I'm going to stop for a minute, and I will come back with some examples of infamous unethical